Elena Fletcher signed her name on the settlement page while the sealing wax was still warm, and by the time she lifted the pen, she had already understood that consent and surrender were not the same thing. The ink smelled metallic in the candle heat. Her mother's solicitor blotted the signature with practiced calm, folded the parchment, and tied it with blue ribbon as if he were wrapping a harmless gift. Across the table, Imogen Fletcher sat very straight in black silk, her gloves untouched beside her teacup, her expression composed in that precise way that never allowed anyone the comfort of anger. "You have done what was required," Imogen said. Elena placed the pen down carefully so her hand would not betray the tremor in her fingers. "The workroom remains open. For now." It was not a quarrel. Imogen never argued. She arranged. By dusk, Elena had been moved into her mother's London townhouse on Bruton Street, where every corridor held the same mingled scent of starch, lamp oil, and old account books, and where each room seemed built for display rather than breathing. The carpets muted footsteps, but not judgment. Portraits of men in powdered wigs watched from gilded frames, none of whom had ever held a needle, none of whom had ever sat up through winter nights balancing wages against coal. Elena had grown up in smaller rooms above the Fletcher workrooms in Kent, where cloth dust floated in afternoon light, and women laughed between seams. Here, laughter sounded improper, like an unpaid bill spoken aloud. The engagement had not yet been announced, though everybody who mattered had already been informed. A title had been selected. A dinner had been scheduled. Elena had been translated from daughter into asset without any visible seam. At supper, Imogen gave instructions the way some women passed salt. "You will smile when addressed." Elena set down her spoon. "Yes, mother." "You will wear the pale silk tomorrow. The ivory does not flatter your complexion under gaslight." "Yes, mother." "You will not be seen in the workrooms while guests are present. A proprietor's daughter may have needed trade. A future Viscountess does not." Eleanor kept her gaze on the polished table. The silver reflected warped versions of their faces. Imogen's narrow and bright, her own blurred at the edges. "As you wish." Imogen turned to the butler before the words had finished leaving Eleanor's mouth, already on the next item, the next placement, the next narrowing corridor through which Eleanor would be expected to pass. That was the architecture of her cruelty. Not shouting, not insults, the removal of alternatives in perfectly reasonable sentences. After supper, Elena climbed to the room prepared for her and found 3 gowns laid across the bed in ascending shades of submission: cream, dove, and pale rose. Each had been altered at the waist without her measurements. Each assumed a body she recognized only in mirrors chosen by someone else. She stood for a long moment with her hand on the bedpost, then moved to the small escritoire in the corner and opened the ledger she had carried from Kent, wrapped in plain linen. 12 names were written there in her neat hand, each followed by weekly wages, family notes, and what she owed if orders faltered. Mrs. Dallow, cough worsening in damp weather. Hester Pike, 2 younger brothers apprenticed and hungry. Nia Bell, mother blind in one eye. 12 women, 12 households leaning quietly against the narrow beam Eleanor had chosen to become. This is the price, she thought. Pay it awake. On the second morning, she asked to inspect stock counts and was refused by a footman who would not meet her eyes. "Mrs. Fletcher's instruction, miss. The clerks will send figures upstairs." "The clerks mismeasure broadcloth when they are hurried." "The instruction remains." She nodded once. "Very well." On the third afternoon, she found one of the kitchen maids crying in the scullery over a split cuff, and mended it herself at the long oak table, while stew simmered and copper pans clicked in the draught. No one asked her to. No one thanked her in words suited to drawing rooms. The maid simply stood still while Eleanor worked, then pressed her fingers to the repaired seam with astonishment, as if a thing made strong again were a private kind of mercy. By the fourth evening in Bruton Street, Elena had learned the new rhythm imposed on her days. Breakfast, with correspondence she was not permitted to answer. Fittings she did not request. Compulsory calls to women who appraised her with bright predatory civility, and long intervals of waiting in rooms that had never seen honest labour. Imogen called it preparation. Elena called it confinement, and did not say the word aloud. A note arrived from Lord Everleigh's sister requesting Elena's preference for wedding flowers, though no proposal had been spoken in her presence, and no date had been offered. Imogen read the note, folded it, and handed it to Eleanor as one might hand a receipt. "You prefer white roses," Imogen said. "I prefer late lilies." White roses signify propriety. Eleanor held the note until the paper softened under her thumb. Then, white roses. Imogen studied her daughter with mild impatience, as if disappointed that resistance had not made the morning more interesting. "You are fortunate, Eleanor. Many women would envy this arrangement. Many women do not pay 12 wages. That will no longer be your concern." It struck Elena then, sharp and clean, that this was the true transaction. Not title for beauty, nor alliance for affection, nor even debt for marriage. It was control in exchange for rescue, written in the language of duty until even coercion could wear gloves. That night, she waited until the house had gone quiet, then carried her basket of mending to the servants' hall, and worked by one low lamp, turning worn cuffs, replacing missing hooks, reinforcing seams at elbows and underarms where movement frayed fabric faster than pride admitted. Needle in, draw through, knot hidden, press flat. The gestures steadied her breathing. Cloth answered honesty better than people did. If tension ran wrong, the fabric puckered and told the truth. Near midnight, the pantry door opened, and old Mr. Keats, the under-butler, paused in surprise at seeing her there. "Miss Fletcher, you ought to be abed." "I ought to be useful." He inclined his head, accepting the distinction without comment. After a moment, he set a cup of tea at her elbow and withdrew. On the fifth day, Imogen summoned her to the morning room where bolts of silk lay unrolled across chairs like surrendered flags. A modiste pinned swatches against Elena's sleeve, while two acquaintances of Imogen observed from the sofa, discussing dowries and settlements as if she were not present. "The Everleigh connection will stabilise the Kent accounts," one woman said. "And the London debts," the other answered. Imogen did not lower her voice. Elena has always understood her obligations. Elena looked at the nearest swatch, a pale green so thin it would show every line beneath. "This one will not wear well." The modiste hesitated, waiting for Imogen. "It need only wear once," Imogen said, "for the announcement." Eleanor met her mother's eyes. They were grey like polished steel, not unkind by appearance, only uninterested in anyone else's interior life. "I will not tear at the shoulder seam if the sleeve is cut on grain." Imogen's expression did not change, but something flickered there, annoyance at being answered in the language of competence rather than compliance. "Then it shall be cut correctly." One of the women on the sofa gave a thin laugh. How practical she is. Practical. The word used for objects and sacrifices. That afternoon, Elena requested permission to visit the Kent workrooms, and was denied in a sentence so flat it might have been weather. "You will remain in London until the announcement. The forewoman requires signatures. Your mother will sign." Eleanor folded her hands to keep them still. "My signature was agreed." Imogen adjusted a stack of invitations by exactly half an inch. "Your signature will be managed." There it was, plain at last. Not merely marriage arranged, but identity absorbed. Eleanor felt the pulse rise in her throat, then settle. She did not cry. Something harder than tears formed inside her, compact and durable as a thimble. "As you wish," she said. When she left the room, she did not go upstairs. She walked instead through the narrow back corridor that led past the household office and the side entrance where deliveries arrived before dawn, where mud marked the flagstones, and no one bothered to polish brass. She stood there a moment with her palm on the cool wall, listening to the distant rattle of carriage wheels, the scrape of crates in the courtyard, the ordinary sounds of work continuing without ceremony. In that unadorned passage, away from portraits and parlours, she could breathe. She told herself nothing dramatic. No vows, no declarations. Only a measured inventory, as exacting as any ledger line. She had traded freedom for time, and time could still be used. If she could not prevent the arrangement today, she could watch, count, gather and wait for one opening wide enough to step through without asking leave. Upstairs, a clock struck the quarter hour. Down the corridor, a servant called for fresh coal. The house moved around her as if she had already become part of its furniture, polished and positioned and mute. Elena turned back toward the stairs with her shoulders straight, carrying in her pocket a folded list of 12 names that no one in that house had asked to see. At the top landing she paused because below her the house had resumed its mechanical breathing. A door closed, silver touched silver. Someone shook ash from a grate. Order restored itself quickly in Bruton Street. Human resistance did not register as damage unless it stained the upholstery. Her room was lit by 2 narrow candles and the pale wash of London moonlight through gauze curtains. The 3 gowns still lay where she had left them, a gradient of obedience across the bedcover. She set her mending basket beneath the escritoire, removed her gloves, and drew out the workroom ledger once more. 12 names, 12 wage lines. She opened the back page and began a second column, this one in ciphered shorthand she had used with her father when creditors had grown curious. Cloth in, cloth out, likely shortfalls, dates when wages must be met to prevent hunger from arriving before pride admitted need. When the final figure was entered, she folded the ledger and tucked it beneath the mattress, not out of melodrama, but because locked drawers belong to servants with keys, and keys belong to Imogen. At 6 the next morning, a maid brought chocolate and a tray of correspondence she did not place in Elena's hands, only on the edge of the escritoire, as if letters might contaminate skin. By 6:30, Miss Harrow from the Modiste stood waiting with pins between her lips. By 7, Imogen had crossed out 2 invitations and added one with a note in the margin. Lady Swithin values composure. By 8, Elena sat in the breakfast room listening while her mother dictated replies that accepted dinners, declined charitable committees, and confirmed fittings for a wedding no one had announced in plain speech. "You will send this to Everley House," Imogen said, tapping a folded note with one gloved finger. Elena looked at the seal. "In whose hand?" "Mine." "That is irregular." "It is efficient." Elena reached for the inkstand, copied the dictated lines in her own hand because refusal would delay nothing, and watched Imogen replace her signature with a sharper, narrower imitation. It was clean work, not perfect, but enough to move money. After breakfast came calls, carriage wheels over wet stone, footmen's knocked rhythm at polished doors, drawing rooms where women in expensive lace asked after Elena's health with bright mouths and unreadable eyes. One lady praised her complexion and asked whether she rode. Another congratulated Imogen on a practical alliance. A third assessed Elena as if considering not a bride, but a fabric sample held to uncertain light. She answered when addressed. She smiled when required. At St. Stephen's she knelt through prayers she could not hear for the pulse in her ears and stood again before anyone could offer an arm. In the churchyard she saw old Mrs. Penbury from Kent, wrapped in a frayed shawl and carrying a basket too heavy for her wrists. Eleanor crossed the paving before protocol could interfere, took half the weight, and walked the woman to her hired cart. Mrs. Penbury blinked at her with watery blue eyes and said, "You are your father's daughter." Then she was gone, and Elena returned to the carriage where Imogen waited with impersonal stillness. "You will not handle market baskets in public," Imogen said when the door closed. She could not lift it alone. There were men present. There were men watching. Imogen did not raise her voice. "You are determined to misunderstand your position." Elena looked out through the glass at the retreating church steps. "I understand it exactly." The house taught her its choreography with relentless precision. Bells announced movement. Meals arrived at fixed minutes. Servants disappeared when guests entered and reappeared, once judgments had been passed. Elena was displayed in rooms with favourable light and kept from doors that led to offices, counting tables, and accounts. Even her silence had assigned hours. She kept her own ledger anyway, hidden under linen, writing by candle end while the city muted itself beyond the windows. One morning she asked for access to the stockroom keys and received a refusal from the household clerk, a narrow man with chalk on his cuffs and no authority of his own. "Mrs. Fletcher has ordered all inventory reconciled through me, miss." "You have never cut broadcloth." "That is not necessary." "It is if you wish to know whether your numbers are fiction." His mouth tightened. "The figures have already been certified." "By whom?" He hesitated. "By instruction." There was no further conversation to be had. Elena inclined her head and stepped aside. 2 footmen carried bolts past her toward the rear hall, and that was when she saw him clearly for the first time. The same man she had glimpsed once through the side passage, broad-shouldered, carrying a crate alone that should have required 2 porters. His shirt was a weathered green flannel, sleeves rolled once at the forearm, collar open at the throat. Nothing remarkable in that. Yet the garment sat across his shoulders with an accuracy that did not belong to ordinary warehouse issue. The seam line met the arm cleanly. The cuff had been turned and restitched by careful hands. Workman's cloth, gentleman's cut. He set the crate down near the receiving table and listened, while the clerk complained about late deliveries. He did not argue. He said one sentence, low and level, and the complaint stopped. "Count again before you accuse." The clerk flushed and bent to his ledger. Elena stood with her gloves in one hand, watching the man adjust the crate's position so it cleared the walkway by precisely the width of a skirt. He did it without looking at her, as if the calculation had been made long before she entered the corridor. When he finally glanced up, his eyes were grey, not cold, simply attentive in a way that implied he missed very little. She moved on before Imogen's maid could mark her lingering at the back entrance, but she carried that seam line in her mind, through luncheon, through another fitting, through an afternoon spent selecting ribbon widths she had not requested. A flannel shirt could be inherited. It could be mended by a careful wife. It could even be stolen from finer rooms. But a shoulder cut like that was intention. Later she saw him again in the courtyard while rain made mirrors of the stone and the cook shouted for coal. Same green flannel, now darkened at the sleeves. Same controlled economy of movement. One porter dropped a crate corner and cursed under his breath. The man in flannel shifted in, took the weight, and steadied the stack without spectacle. When the kitchen boy tried to drag a basket twice his size, The man relieved him of it with a brief nod. No lecture, no display. Soon after, Elena found a paper pattern on the back stairs, half crushed under a boot print, marked with chalk notation in a hand she did not recognize. She lifted it, brushed off soot, and carried it toward the receiving room to return it, before the chalk blurred. At the threshold she found the flannel-clad man fitting twine around a parcel. "This was dropped," she said. He wiped his hands on a cloth before taking the pattern from her, as if refusing to stain the paper. "Thank you, Miss Fletcher." He knew her name, not surprising in her mother's house. Still, the formal address struck her. Most labourers would have said Miss and left it there. As he folded the pattern, the front placket of his shirt shifted, and she saw it. Minute hand-stitching hidden inside the seam, a maker's reinforcement where no one but a tailor would look. Near the hem, nearly concealed by wear, 2 tiny letters in dark silk thread. B and H twined together. Brant and Hale. Elena had handled coats from that house in her father's workroom when aristocratic clients sent repairs south to avoid London gossip. Brant and Hale dressed peers and barristers, men whose names appeared on subscription lists and parliamentary committees. They did not clothe dock labourers who hauled crates in back courtyards. She kept her face still. "The chalk will smudge if it is left by the stove." He looked at the pattern, then at her. "I am aware." Grey eyes, watchful, unstartled. She inclined her head and stepped aside. The exchange lasted less than a minute. It altered the texture of the day. That evening, Bruton Street hosted a creditor who arrived without fanfare and entered through the side door, which meant the debt was serious enough to hide. Elena had been sent upstairs after supper with embroidery she did not intend to finish. She descended instead by the narrow service stair to ask Mr. Keats whether the Kent dispatches had arrived. Halfway down the corridor she heard voices through the half-open study door, and stopped because her mother's tone had flattened to that particular register she used when discussing people as placements rather than persons. "Everleigh will settle the first note upon announcement," Imogen was saying. "The second is covered by transfer once the marriage articles are executed." A man answered, uneasy. "If Miss Fletcher objects." "She is not to be consulted, only positioned." A pause. Paper sliding across wood. The creditor cleared his throat. "And the workrooms?" "Collateral until the signatures are regularized." Eleanor's hand closed around the banister spindle, hard enough for wood grain to mark her palm. Her breathing shortened, then steadied by force. Not surprise. Confirmation. The words moved through her like cold iron set in place. She did not enter the room. She did not make a sound. She stepped back from the door and turned toward the rear passage, where lamps burned lower and floors remembered mud. At the end of that corridor, near the side entrance, the man in the green flannel stood with an empty crate at his feet, as if he had set it down to listen for instructions and found a different kind of order being issued. He looked directly at her. No startlement, no feigned ignorance. The grey of his eyes held the same difficult steadiness she had seen in the courtyard, now sharpened by something she could not name. "You should not stand where doors can close," he said. The sentence was quiet, measured, and entirely unlike advice offered by a man who merely carried crates. Eleanor did not step back from him. The corridor lamp threw a thin, amber line along the crate at his boots, across his hands, over the worn edge of the green flannel where the cuff had been turned and stitched with care. "And where," she asked, her voice level, "does one stand in this house?" He shifted his weight once, not from discomfort, but to clear the passage as a maid approached with coal scuttles. "Where there is an exit you control." The maid passed between them, eyes lowered. By the time the sound of her steps faded, he had lifted the crate again. "You heard her," Elena said quietly. I hear a great deal in passages, he answered. So do you. No sympathy entered his tone, and for that she was grateful. Sympathy in Bruton Street was often another form of ownership. She inclined her head. Good evening. Good evening, Miss Fletcher. He went toward the receiving room without looking back. Elena stood one heartbeat longer in the rear corridor, then climbed the service stair, entered her room, and copied from memory every word she had heard at the study door onto a scrap torn from an old order sheet. She folded that scrap into a square no larger than a coin and slid it under the ledger beneath her mattress. The next morning began with delivery wagons before dawn and a breakfast invitation from Lady Swithin that Imogen accepted in Elena's name before the tray had cooled. By the time the household clock struck 9, the back courtyard was full of motion. Crates thudded onto stone, porters shouted measurements over one another, and the cook's assistant argued about missing flour with the certainty of a woman whose kitchen would be blamed for another man's shortage. Elena watched from the threshold of the back hall while a footman waited to escort her upstairs for yet another fitting. 2 minutes, she told him. Mrs. Fletcher said, 2 minutes. She crossed to the pump herself, took the tin dipper, and filled 3 glasses from the stone basin. The water was sharp with cold. She handed one to the kitchen boy first, because his face had gone pale with exertion. Another to an older porter with a cough she had heard every morning that week, and then she turned toward the man in green flannel. He had just set down a crate marked with naval stamps, his sleeves damp to the elbow. For you, she said. He looked at the glass, then at her, as if measuring not the offer but the order in which she had made it. He accepted with a small inclination of his head. Miss Fletcher. She took her own glass only after he had drunk. The water steadied her throat. For a moment they stood in the noise of the yard as if in a pocket of silence neither had requested. A cartwheel jolted against the curb behind her. The crate nearest her skirt tipped half an inch. He moved with quick economy, one hand on the crate, one at the edge of the cart shaft, correcting both before the wood could strike her. You should not stand here when they reverse, he said. Elaborate rules for where I may stand, she replied. His mouth shifted, not quite a smile. Only in yards with poor supervision. She could have asked his name then. She could have asked why a man with Brant and Hale stitches hidden in his shirt spoke as if he had managed warehouses, ships and men who lied on paper. Instead, she set her empty glass on the pump ledge and handed the dipper back to the kitchen boy. Thank you for the warning, she said. Thank you for the water. The footman had reached the yard by then, breathless with disapproval. Elena returned with him to the stairs, the faint taste of iron from the pump still on her tongue, and the stranger's measured voice lodged beside yesterday's overheard sentence, each refusing to leave. 3 days passed before she saw him beyond the walls of Bruton Street. Imogen had required attendance at a charity call followed by prayers at St. Stephen's, and the church steps filled with lacquered carriages, polished boots, and women in hats too large for mercy. Elena descended behind her mother, accepted nods from ladies who praised her composure, and waited while footmen sorted parasols and gossip in equal quantity. Near the lower steps, 2 porters from a neighbouring house had dropped a bolt of wool from its wrapping and now argued in low, furious bursts about whose account would be docked. One swore the tally was wrong before delivery. The other blamed short measure from the supplier. Between them, the wool darkened against damp stone, while people stepped around it as if labour had no right to occupy church ground. The man in green flannel came from the side lane carrying invoices under one arm. He did not raise his voice. If you quarrel longer than you count, the numbers will still accuse you, he said. The first porter snapped back. And who made you clerk? The answer came without heat. No one. Count. Perhaps it was his tone. Perhaps it was that he had already crouched and begun measuring the bolt against the printed mark before either porter could decide whether to resent him. Whatever the cause, both men bent down and counted with him. 36 yards, not 40. A bad entry at source. The argument ended in a muttered apology to no one in particular. Elena watched from halfway up the steps while Lady Swithin described a cousin's engagement beside her. No one in the polished crowd seemed to notice that a dispute had been resolved with more authority than most men employed in drawing rooms could manage over port. When the carriage finally pulled away, Imogen adjusted her gloves and spoke without turning her head. "You will keep your attention on people who can assist your future." Eleanor looked out through the moving glass. "I am learning exactly who can." Imogen's expression did not alter. "Do not answer me with riddles." Eleanor folded her hands over her reticule, then asked me direct questions. No reply came. The carriage rolled on. By the second week of October, Eleanor had begun rising before the maid's knock, so she could steal half an hour in the townhouse garden before schedules fastened around her again. The garden was narrow and formal, bordered with clipped yew and late roses losing petals to the path. At that hour the city was reduced to distant wheels and the brush of broom bristles on stone. She carried a small notebook hidden inside a devotional cover and copied inventory numbers from memory. Broadcloth in, Kersey out, yardage inconsistencies appearing in the same clerk's hand. On a grey morning she turned a corner by the espaliered pear wall and found him there, not in the act of spying, simply standing with a coil of rope and 2 sealed parcels at his feet as if waiting for a gate to be opened. He looked at the notebook in her hand. "You are not writing prayers." "No," she said. "I am writing arithmetic." She should have closed the cover. She did not. Instead, she held out the page where figures refused to align. "Tell me what you see." His glance moved over the columns once. "I see fraud made lazy by repetition." The words landed with the quiet certainty of a man naming a familiar fault in machinery. "Where?" she asked. He tapped one line with his forefinger, careful not to touch the ink. "This invoice claims 42 yards of navy kersey produced 19 officer coats." It could with narrow panels. Not if the cloth was milled at Portsmouth width, and this mark says Portsmouth. He lifted his hand. "You are being charged for cloth that never arrived." She felt the pulse rise behind her eyes, less from surprise than from the speed of his assessment. "You read procurement marks." "I read what men hide in margins." A housemaid opened the terrace door at the far end and hesitated at seeing them in conversation. Eleanor closed the notebook at once. "I am told not to concern myself with stock," she said. "Then do not concern yourself," he answered. "Record it." She almost smiled at that, a dry edge of humour she had not expected from him. "You give orders freely." "I give useful ones." A bell rang from inside for breakfast service. He lifted the parcels. "Miss Fletcher." "Sir," she said, though she still had no name to attach to the title. He exited through the side gate before the maid could gather enough curiosity to carry upstairs. That evening, denied entry to the principal workrooms while guests toured the front salons, Elena took the outer corridor that ran behind the receiving office and stopped at the threshold where lamplight spilled across stacked bolts. The senior clerk stood with 2 assistants over shipping forms, arguing about a pending naval contract and whether the house should bid on winter cloth for government stores. Their confidence sounded expensive and uninformed. "We can substitute the softer lot," one assistant said. "They will never know once dyed." "They will know at sea," came a voice from behind the stacked crates. The man in flannel stepped into view, carrying a manifest board. "Salt stiffens poor weave. It cracks at the fold. You will lose the contract on first inspection." The clerk gave a brittle laugh. "You haul boxes. Leave procurement to those employed for it." He set the manifest down and turned it so the stamp faced them. "That lot is combed Lincoln, not naval kersey. Different shrink, different wear. If you cut officer coats from it, the shoulders will pull by December." Eleanor felt the old tailor's instinct answer him before thought. He was right. Lincoln combing held a fine hand, but lost shape under hard moisture unless lined heavily, and naval contracts never paid for generous lining. The clerk frowned, checked the bail stamp himself, and swore softly when he saw the mark. One assistant began rewriting the order in quick, embarrassed strokes. No one thanked the man in flannel. He did not wait for thanks. He lifted the corrected manifest, spoke 2 short instructions about loading sequence and wagon timing, and the assistants obeyed as though he had every right to direct them. Elena remained in the doorway, half in shadow. He noticed her only when the clerk and assistants had scattered. "You are not meant to be here," he said. "Neither are errors." His gaze held hers for one measured second, then shifted to the corridor behind her, checking for witnesses before he spoke again. "If you want proof, keep the rejected manifests. They burn the originals when corrections become inconvenient." A new thread pulled taut in her mind. Where would they keep them before burning? Bottom drawer, receiving desk, left side locked badly. She absorbed the detail without moving. How do you know which side is locked badly? He bent to lift another crate. Because men who steal from women rarely expect women to check the lock. That sentence followed her upstairs, through supper where Lord Everleigh's name was mentioned 4 times, and never by Elena, through a fitting where the modiste fretted over sleeve drape, while Elena counted in her head how many altered manifests could fit inside a devotional cover. Late that night she went down not to the servants' hall but to the receiving office. Mr. Keats had left the side corridor unlatched for coal delivery. The house slept in layers of disciplined silence. Eleanor entered the dark office with one candle shielded by her palm, found the desk, tested the left drawer, and felt the lock give exactly as he had said. Inside lay a packet of discarded manifests tied with string. She did not take all of them. She selected 4 that matched entries in her notebook, copied the numbers and dates on thin tracing paper, and returned every sheet to the order she had found it. The candle sputtered once as she retied the packet. Her hand remained steady. When she slipped back into the corridor, he was there at the far end near the courtyard door, a shape in worn green against brick and shadow, waiting without approaching. She closed the office door behind her and kept her voice low. "Your lock was indeed poor. And your arithmetic, improving." He gave that slight near smile again, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Good." For several breaths neither spoke. It was not intimacy. It was recognition, narrower and perhaps more dangerous. 2 people in a house built on arrangement, both refusing to miscount what was in front of them. From the upper floor came the faint chime of the half-hour. Eleanor tucked the copied figures into her sleeve. "I will return these to my ledger," she said. "Keep them dry," he replied. "Ink runs faster than memory." She inclined her head and turned toward the stairs. At the first landing, she looked back once. He had already lifted a crate and moved into the courtyard, the green flannel disappearing into the work of the house, as if he had always belonged to its margins and never to its centre. Yet every day those margins widened, and within them Elena was beginning to find room enough to act. She climbed the remaining stairs with copied figures against her skin, entered her room, and locked the door with deliberate care. The house had settled into its midnight hush, a layered quiet made of banked coals and distant wheels on wet stone. She drew the ledger from beneath the mattress, transcribed the manifest numbers by candlelight, and added one line beneath them in a hand so small it looked like thread. Left drawer, receiving desk, lock weak, corrections concealed. Then she folded the tracing papers into oiled silk and tucked them inside the ledger's back cover, where moisture could not blur ink and curious fingers would meet only devotional verses pasted over a false board. At dawn, she was summoned to the breakfast room in pale blue, then redirected to the household office, then sent upstairs again because Lady Swithin's card had arrived earlier than expected, and Imogen preferred her daughter to look expensive and compliant when seen in daylight. The morning became another procession of adjustments. Cuffs were pinned, hair was smoothed. A jeweller's tray appeared and disappeared. By the time Eleanor was released from inspection, her head ached from perfume and instruction. "Your expression must suggest gratitude," Imogen said while fastening one bracelet at Elena's wrist and removing it again because the stones were too assertive. "Not triumph. I have offered neither." "Then offer less." Elena lowered her eyes, not in submission, but to hide the sharpened calm gathering beneath her ribs. "As you wish." She was sent at last to deliver a note to the upper workroom where alterations were being finished for an evening reception. It was the nearest she had come in days to the sound of needles moving with purpose. The room smelled of pressing irons, chalk, and wool warming near a grate. Women bent over seams in concentrated silence broken by clipped exchanges about hem width and sleeve pitch. Elena felt her shoulders settle 1 degree, as if her body recognized a language no drawing room spoke. Mrs. Dallow sat at the end table by the window, spectacles low on her nose, hands thinner than Eleanor remembered from Kent. The older seamstress paused twice in 1 minute to ease her breath, then resumed backstitching with stubborn precision. Her cough had deepened since autumn began. Each spell left colour drained from her face. Elena crossed to her and set the note aside. "You should be at the pressing station, not on heavy seams," Elena said quietly. Mrs. Dallow gave a dry little sound that was not quite laughter. "And leave these girls to wrestle velvet alone? They would mutiny by tea." "You're shaking." "I am old, miss. It is what old hands do." Their eyes met, and in that moment Eleanor saw the fatigue under the seamstress's steadiness, the private arithmetic of medicine against rent against food. The same arithmetic Elena had been carrying in secret for months. At the far side of the room the door opened. Imogen entered with the household clerk and one of Lady Swithin's companions, a woman with bright rings and a perpetual look of polite disappointment. Conversations snapped to stillness. Needles paused mid-air. Imogen's gaze moved across the tables, assessing output rather than people. "Which of you is Dallow?" Mrs. Dallow rose with difficulty, one hand braced on the table edge. "I am, madam. You are behind schedule on 4 bodices and 1 evening wrap. I completed the wrap at first light. It awaits trimming." The clerk consulted his page. "Her output is down 28% this fortnight." Mrs. Dallow's jaw tightened. "Because I was set to heavy cloth 2 days with no assistant." Imogen did not look at her directly while answering. "This house cannot carry sentiment in place of speed. You are dismissed at week's end." A silence followed so complete Elena could hear the hiss of steam from the pressing board. No one moved, no one argued. Dismissal in this room was not merely loss of wages, it was the narrowing of all subsequent doors. Elena stepped forward 1 pace. "Mrs. Dallow trained half this table." Imogen turned her head, and now she slows it. She has earned lighter assignment. She has consumed it. Eleanor kept her voice level in front of the women who depended on her not to break. Her grandson is ill. She has requested only mornings for the next month. Her family arrangements are irrelevant to payroll. The companion with bright rings adjusted her glove and smiled at nothing. Prudence can feel unkind in the moment, Mrs. Fletcher, but it protects the whole. Imogen gave a small nod, as if the point had been elegantly made. Exactly. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Dallow's hands, at the tremor she was trying to hide by clasping them behind her back, and understood that speaking further here would expose the seamstress to sharper punishment, not mercy. She inclined her head. "Very well," she said. 4 words. Control preserved. Imogen turned to the clerk. "Have her station reassigned by noon." Then she left as she had entered, without raised voice, without haste, with the certainty of someone accustomed to consequences being borne by others. When the door closed, the room exhaled in fragments. One girl resumed stitching too quickly and pricked her thumb, sucking in a breath through her teeth. Mrs. Dallow sat down slowly and stared at the unfinished seam before her, as if trying to remember what came next. Elena placed a hand briefly on the older woman's shoulder. "Do not pack yet. Miss, there is no use." "There is still work to do," Elena said. "Finish the wrap." She passed the note to the forewoman and left before anyone could see the change in her face. By the following afternoon, London's narrow lanes around Hanover Square were slick with a fine mist, and Elena was not expected outside until dusk. She used that small gap in Imogen's schedule with a precision learned from years of fitting urgent orders between impossible deadlines. She changed from reception silk into plain walking wool, pinned her veil low, and took the back stair with a covered basket over her arm, as if delivering mending. Mr. Keats saw her at the service door and did not ask where she was going. At the corner of Brook Street, she turned into a jeweller's side office that dealt in private transactions and discreet losses. The bell above the door gave one soft note. Inside, glass cases held brooches and watch chains in orderly rows that looked to Eleanor like a museum of surrendered necessities. The proprietor, Mr. Lennox, recognized quality before identity. His gaze settled on the bracelet Eleanor set on black velvet, gold filigree, seed pearls, and a tiny concealed clasp her father had repaired once with his own hands when she was 15. The last piece of him she still wore. "You are seeking valuation or immediate sale, miss?" he asked. "Immediate." He lifted a loop, examined the hinges, tested weight on a scale fine enough to measure regret in grains. "Family piece." "Yes." "Do you require a repurchase clause?" She thought of Imogen's ledgers, of signatures managed, of how quickly keepsakes became leverage once known. "No." He named a sum. It was fair and therefore painful. Elena held his eyes. "Add 12%. On what grounds?" "On workmanship at clasp and lattice, and because you will resell in May when pearls fetch more." A pause, then a slight incline of his head. "You are in trade." "I was raised in one." He added the amount without further contest, counted notes and coin, and slid a receipt across the counter. Elena signed with a steady hand, folded the receipt into her glove, and took the money in 2 packets, one sealed, one loose. At the threshold, she touched the inside of her wrist, where the bracelet had rested for years. Skin cooler there, lighter and not lighter. She went from the jeweller to an apothecary on Davies Street, where she purchased laudanum substitute, cough syrup, and tonic powders under Mrs. Dallow's name, paying in cash to avoid household records. The apothecary wrote instructions on stiff cream paper and wrapped the bottles in straw. Elena added coal vouchers from a parish office, then returned to Bruton Street through the Mews, so no one at the front would mark parcels in her hands. In the rear corridor, she found Mrs. Dallow waiting on a bench with her shawl bundled on her lap. Dismissed earlier than promised. Her eyes looked smaller without proper light. "They sent me off at noon," the seamstress said. "No quarrel, just done." Eleanor sat beside her, set the basket between them, and opened it. Medicines first, then vouchers. Finally, the sealed packet of wages. 3 months, Elena said. "Paid in advance through Mr. Keats's account, recorded as contract completion. No one can challenge it without admitting false entries." Mrs. Dallow stared at the packet without touching it. "Miss, this is too much. It is exact. I cannot take your—" "You can." Elena placed the packet firmly in her hands. "Your grandson will see a physician on Tuesday. Mr. Keats has arranged transport. You will not return here unless invited by your own terms." The older woman's mouth trembled once, then steadied. "How will you balance this?" Elena closed the basket. "I have balanced it." A movement in the courtyard drew her eye. The man in green flannel stood near the loading gate with a coil of rope over one shoulder, still as a post in shadow. He had likely been there from the beginning. She had not heard him arrive. Mrs. Dallow followed her glance and gave a small, surprised breath. "That one brought my parcel from the apothecary himself. Would not leave it to a boy." Eleanor looked back at him. Their distance held, but the line of his face had shifted, guard eased by something close to astonishment. Then, slowly, he smiled. It transformed him, not prettier, clearer. The stern labourer's mask fell away for a single measured second, and what remained was unmistakable command, restrained by choice. He crossed the stone toward them, stopped at respectful distance, and addressed Mrs. Dallow first. "Your cart is ready." The seamstress clutched the packet to her chest. "You have done too much for an old woman in one day." He gave a slight nod. "The account is not closed yet." His gaze moved to Eleanor. Grey eyes exact and unreadable except for that lingering warmth at their edges. "You sold something," he said quietly. Elena did not pretend confusion. "Yes. For her, yes." The near smile touched his mouth again, then vanished into composure. "Miss Fletcher," she rose. "Sir." He stepped aside to clear her path to the inner door, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. She went back inside with the empty basket, pulse high but even, and did not look back until she reached the corridor turn. By then he was helping Mrs. Dallow into the cart with an attention that treated frailty as dignity, not burden. 3 days later, Elena stood outside the blue drawing room with a tray of correspondence she had been instructed to deliver and not discuss. The house was full of visiting relations. Laughter travelled through open doors in controlled peals. Silver chimed. Somewhere a piano stumbled through the same 8 bars twice. Elena paused at the drawing room threshold because she heard her name, then remained still because her mother's tone had flattened into that administrative calm she reserved for transactions concealed beneath family language. Aunt Beatrice's voice came first, dry with curiosity. "Everly's sister asks whether affection has improved since the understanding. She worries about public awkwardness." Imogen answered with mild boredom. "Affection is irrelevant." Paper rustled. A teacup touched saucer. Aunt Beatrice lowered her voice, though not enough. "And Eleanor's objections?" "Managed?" "In what form?" "In legal form." Imogen spoke each word as if entering figures in a ledger. "Once married, Eleanor's signature transfers to me by proxy for estate coordination. The Kent interests consolidate. Her consent has already served its purpose." Elena felt the tray edge bite into her palms. She adjusted her grip so the letters would not slide, though she could no longer feel her fingertips clearly. Heat rose up her throat, then dropped, leaving her breath shallow and precise. She fixed her gaze on the brass hinge of the half-open door, because if she looked into the room, she might betray the shaking that had begun at her wrists. Aunt Beatrice gave a soft, disapproving hum that held no real objection. "You always were efficient, Imogen. Efficiency keeps houses solvent, and daughters obedient. Sometimes those are the same task. There it was, not even cruelty performed as cruelty, merely policy." Elena stepped back from the doorway without sound, the tray still level in her hands. Her knuckles had gone white against the silver rim. At the corridor window, she set the correspondence down on a side table because her fingers would not obey on command. She pressed her thumb hard into her palm until sensation returned in small, painful sparks. She did not cry. The impulse passed through her and hardened into structure, beam by beam, signature by proxy, consent already used. Her mother had not merely planned a marriage. She had planned erasure in stages, each stage properly witnessed, each document apparently lawful. From below came the rumble of a delivery cart entering the mews, followed by a voice in the yard giving short instructions that carried through stone. She knew that voice now, even when she could not see him. Steady, economical, certain where weight should fall. Elena lifted the correspondence again and walked, not to the blue drawing room, but toward the rear stair where the household office kept blank paper, sealing wax, and the key index for every room in the house. Her breath had steadied by the second landing. By the time she reached the office door, her hands no longer shook at all. Elena opened the household office door and stepped inside without summoning a maid, a clerk, or permission. The room smelled of sealing wax and damp wool, with rows of labelled pigeonholes marching up the wall like a regiment of small obediences. She set the correspondence tray on the desk, took one sheet of foolscap, and began to write, while her pulse still beat hard in her throat. Not a letter, an inventory of danger. Proxy clause overheard in blue drawing room. Marriage articles expected at Everley House. Signatures being managed. She blotted the ink, folded the page once, and tucked it into the ledger hidden under her shawl. Then she opened the key index drawer, found the brass tag for the study dispatch box, and slipped it into her palm. She crossed the corridor and entered Imogen's study as if she had every right. The fire had burned low. A map of shipping routes lay under glass on the central table. In the grate, half-charred paper curled inward on itself. Elena went directly to the dispatch box, unlocked it with the tag, and found what she had expected: draft marriage settlements, correspondence with Everley's solicitor, and a separate packet marked estate coordination, to be executed upon marriage. She did not take the originals. She copied the operative language in a tight hand, line by line, including the phrase that turned her signature into a mechanism for transfer. When she finished, she replaced each document in exact order, closed the box, and returned the key tag to the office drawer before anyone could remark it missing. As she stepped back into the corridor, Imogen appeared at the far end with Aunt Beatrice at her side. Imogen's gaze landed first on Elena's face, then on her empty hands, then on the study door left slightly ajar. "You were not called," Imogen said. "I no longer wait to be called." Aunt Beatrice made a soft sound, half scandal and half satisfaction at fresh conflict. Imogen's expression did not alter. "You will deliver those letters and return upstairs. Lord Everley's sister arrives at 5. Eleanor held her mother's eyes. "The arrangement ends tonight." Imogen's tone remained bored, which made it crueler. "You are not equipped to end anything." Elena inclined her head by a fraction. "Watch me." She took the tray, delivered every letter to its proper table and hand, and did not miss one instruction on her way. That obedience cost her 10 minutes and bought her invisibility. By the time the hall clock struck the hour, she was back in her room with the door bolted, the 3 ceremonial gowns pushed aside, and one valise open on the bed. She packed with a precision that felt like breath returning. 2 serviceable dresses, 1 wool cloak, underlinen, boots, her father's measuring tape, the workroom ledger, the copied manifests sealed in oiled silk, the note from the study door, the new transcription of the proxy clause, and the folded list of 12 names. She added the jeweller's receipt, not for sentiment, but for accounting. What she did not pack mattered as much. Pearls, invitation cards, every ribbon chosen for the wedding announcement. She left all of it. 3 days of cold clarity had already stripped drama from the decision. At the dressing table, she untied the engagement ribbon from her wrist, took scissors from her mending basket, and cut the silk cleanly in 2. She laid both pieces beside Imogen's calling cards where they would be found before dinner. Then she wrote one line on a card in her neat trade hand: "I will not sign by proxy." The ink dried while she laced her boots. At the door, she paused only once, because footsteps sounded in the passage. It was Mr. Keats with fresh coal, his lined face composed in the manner of men who survive powerful households by never appearing surprised. His eyes moved from the valise to her travelling cloak. "You are leaving by the Mews, miss," he said, not asking. "Yes." He shifted the coal scuttle to his other hand. "Front hall is crowded with callers. Rear stair is clear for the next 4 minutes." Elena reached into her reticule and gave him the packet labelled Dallow accounts, containing the copied yardage discrepancies, and one short note naming where the originals were stored. "If I do not return tonight, this goes to Mr. Arden at the Guildhall Registry," she said, into his hand only. Mr. Keats accepted it without unfolding the paper. "Understood." She looked at him steadily. "This may cost you your post." He gave the faintest lift of one shoulder. "Posts can be replaced. Integrity less so." Within 20 minutes of leaving her room, she was in the back courtyard with one bag in her hand and rain beginning in a fine, cold mist that silvered the stone. A carriage stood by the Mews gate, plain black, lanterns unadorned. Not Everley livery, not Fletcher. She recognized the coachman from the church lane, though he wore no household colours. The green flannelled man waited near the stable door. No crate at his feet now, no rope over his shoulder. He had removed the flannel. In its place he wore a dark travelling coat cut to him with the same unshowy exactness she had read in his seams from the first day. He spoke first. "You came." "I said I would act." His gaze shifted briefly to her valise, then back to her face. "Did anyone stop you?" "No." "Did you leave evidence behind?" "No." Only then did he open the carriage door. The interior held 2 leather folios, a travel rug, and a small iron lockbox bolted beneath the seat. Not a flight prepared in panic. A move prepared in law. Elena remained on the stone. "Before I enter, I require truth." He inclined his head once. In the lantern light, his features looked less guarded, the old reserve sharpened into decision. "My name is Julian Hale, Marquis of Wexford," he said. The sentence landed quietly, without ornament, and reordered every corridor in her memory. The command in the courtyard, the procurement marks read at a glance, the Branton Hale stitch hidden in plain cloth, the men who obeyed him before they realized they were obeying. He continued in the same measured tone. I purchased controlling interest in the notes tied to Fletcher House 6 weeks ago. I did it to block transfer by coercion, not to claim your person." Rain tapped once against the carriage roof. Elena felt the old reflex to mistrust power rise and hold, then meet a second fact she could not dismiss. He had watched, tested, and intervened only where harm became structural, never at her expense, never with performance. She asked, "Why the flannel?" "To see who offered water before rank," he said. "To learn which accounts were honest when no title was in the room." The dry edge of humour touched her despite herself. A severe method. A reliable one. She handed him the oiled silk packet from her valise. "Copied manifests, altered entries, and proxy language from my mother's dispatch box. Mr. Keats holds a duplicate summary addressed to Guildhall Council." He took the packet and, for the first time, his composure shifted by a degree. Respect, plain and untheatrical. "You prepared redundancies," he said. "I was raised in debt seasons." He placed the packet in the iron lockbox, turned the key, and gave it to her, not to the coachman. "Keep this." She looked down at the key in her gloved palm, small, cold, absolute. "I expected you to ask for trust," she said. "I ask for judgment," he answered. "If you decide against me, I return you anywhere you name with armed escort and these documents in your possession." That was the final hinge. Not rescue claimed as debt. Not protection bartered for gratitude. A door opened and she could choose whether to walk through. By the time the Muse clock struck the half-hour, Elena sat inside the carriage with her bag at her feet and the lockbox key threaded onto her father's measuring tape for safety. Julian took the opposite seat rather than the place beside her, leaving space where coercion might have sat. The coachman snapped the reins. Wheels moved over wet stone. Bruton Street began to recede through the rain-streaked glass, its lit windows bright with supper preparations, and quiet confidence that she would appear when summoned. She did not appear. For several streets neither spoke. London narrowed and widened around them. Butcher lamps shuttered shop fronts, the dark sheen of paving under gaslight. Elena rested one hand on the ledger in her lap and felt, beneath the leather cover, the thickness of names and numbers that had kept her awake for months. Her breathing had steadied, her shoulders no longer held against an expected blow. Julian broke the silence first. "There will be notice filed before midnight. Injunction against execution of proxy documents. Petition for independent standing of your signature on Kent interests." She turned toward him. "Whose counsel?" "Arden and Vale. You named Arden to Keats. Correct choice." That detail told her he had anticipated not only her departure, but the exact architecture of proof she would require to leave without being erased as hysterical, disobedient, or confused. Not romance, alignment. "And Lord Everley?" she asked. "His solicitor received warning this afternoon that contested articles carry reputational and financial hazard. He will withdraw before breakfast." Elena looked out again as they crossed into a quieter square. "My mother will call this theft." "Let her," he said. "She cannot call arithmetic theft when her own signatures are under review." The carriage turned beneath a stone arch and entered a narrower lane lined with brick mews houses kept plain from the street and disciplined within. They stopped before a blue-black door with an iron knocker worn bright by use. Julian stepped down, offered his hand, and waited without insistence. Elena accepted because the step was slick and because refusal for form alone had no value left. Inside, the front room was modest and warm, with a writing table already set for two, and a fire laid low but living. On that table sat 3 sealed envelopes, each addressed in different hands. Guildhall Registry, Everley Solicitor, Fletcher House Banking Office. Prepared outcomes, not improvised hopes. Julian removed his gloves and set them beside the seals. A signet ring flashed once in the firelight, the same crest she had seen stamped on parliamentary notices pinned outside the exchange. He spoke without ceremony. "You may sleep here tonight under my protection or depart at once with escort. If you remain, we attend Guildhall at first light and place every paper on record in your name." Elena set her valise by the chair, untied the measuring tape from her wrist, and placed the lockbox key on top of the ledger where both could be seen. "I remain," she said. "Not surrender. Choice." Julian inclined his head, and the rare smile returned, brief and transforming, before he turned to the writing table and broke the first seal for filing. Wax cracked under his ring with a dry snap, and Julian slid the first document toward her across the writing table. The paper was an injunction draft already populated with dates, account numbers, and the legal description of her Kent interests down to field boundaries and mill rights. 2 blank lines waited for her name. "Elena Fletcher, in her own right," he said. "Read every line." She read all of it, lips parted slightly as her eyes moved from clause to clause. The language was severe and clean. No proxy authority valid without direct execution in the signatory's presence. Immediate stay on marriage article transfers tied to disputed debt instruments. Order to preserve records in the Bruton Street receiving office and study dispatch box, pending review. She set the page down. "This preserves the originals?" "It compels preservation," Julian said, "and imposes penalty if anyone burns, alters, or removes." She signed once, then again, on the accompanying affidavit, blotting both signatures herself. On the third envelope, addressed to Fletcher House Banking Office, she paused. "If my mother presents prior authorization?" Julian handed her a second sheet. "Countermand, bearing tonight's time mark and witness seal. Arden will file first. The bank manager values punctual legality more than family confidence." He was right. She signed that one too. A quiet knock sounded. Mr. Keats entered, hat in his hands, coat damp at the hem. He looked from Elena to Julian, then placed a packet on the table. Dallow accounts, exactly as she had given it, now sealed with fresh wax in his own careful hand. "You did not need to send this," Elena said. "I did not send it, miss. I carried it." His lined face remained composed, though fatigue sat heavily beneath his eyes. "And I brought one more item from Bruton Street. The engagement ribbon cards were found. Mrs. Fletcher dismissed 2 maids and blamed theft. The ribbon is no longer there." Julian's gaze sharpened. "Removed by whom?" Mr. Keats hesitated, then answered with precise neutrality. "By me, my lord. I judged it likely to be altered into evidence of instability. It is intact." From his inner pocket he produced the 2 cut lengths of pale silk and laid them beside the affidavits. Elena touched the frayed edge where her scissors had gone through cleanly. A private act, now safeguarded as proof of refusal, not caprice. What Lady Fletcher did not know, Mr. Keats said quietly, was that servants read ledgers too. He accepted no praise, only the receipt Julian wrote acknowledging chain of custody for the ribbon and packet. When he left, he carried a sealed note from Arden guaranteeing his post for 30 days in Wexford service should Bruton Street close its doors to him. He bowed to Eleanor at the threshold. "Guildhall opens at 8. By 8:15 the stone hall smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and old dust warmed by coal grates. Elena stood at a long oak table where 3 months earlier she had been made to wait in a side corridor while clerks processed her mother's instructions as if Elena herself were an attachment. This time the registrar addressed her directly. "Miss Fletcher, Confirm your petition to strike proxy execution language from the proposed articles and preserve your independent signature authority over Kent assets. I confirm, she said. Arden, narrow and alert behind wire spectacles, arranged exhibits in deliberate sequence. The copied proxy clause from Imogen's dispatch box, manifest discrepancies from the receiving desk packet, her ledger with the 12 wage lines and corresponding disbursements, including the jeweller's receipt and medicine vouchers, to establish motive and timing. The note she had written in the household office listing overheard terms. Then, under court order served before dawn, the original dispatch box drafts brought in by bailiff, seals unbroken. Imogen arrived 10 minutes later in black silk and controlled displeasure, accompanied by her solicitor and Aunt Beatrice, whose curiosity had finally met consequence. Imogen's gaze moved over Eleanor with the same cool assessment she used for flawed cloth. "You have created a spectacle," Imogen said. Eleanor did not lower her eyes. "No, Mother. I filed arithmetic." Imogen turned to the registrar. "My daughter is distressed. This petition is a misunderstanding amplified by predatory advisers." Arden spoke before Eleanor could answer. "Then we will rely on handwriting, timestamps, and your own correspondence, madam." The first collapse came quietly. Everleigh's solicitor did not appear. Instead, a clerk delivered a folded notice bearing Everleigh's seal. Withdrawal from proposed match. Immediate termination of article negotiations, no claim asserted. The registrar read it into record without inflection and set it atop the stack where everyone could see. Aunt Beatrice made a small, involuntary sound. She did not speak again. The second collapse was procedural. Under questioning, Imogen's solicitor admitted he had drafted proxy coordination language contingent on marriage execution, though he insisted it was standard among families. Arden placed beside that claim a letter in Imogen's hand, instructing that Eleanor's signature be managed prior to formal execution. Imogen's mouth tightened by a degree. "You obtained private correspondence unlawfully," she said. Julian answered from Elena's left, voice even. "Produced under injunction from records you were ordered to preserve." The registrar called Mr. Keats, who testified with understated clarity to document handling, key access protocols, and the existence of corrected manifests removed nightly from the receiving desk. He did not embellish. He did not tremble. The chalk-cuffed clerk was then called and, under oath with the original manifests spread before him, conceded that quantities had been altered by instruction and that rejected drafts were meant for burning. Asked whose instruction, he looked toward Imogen, then at the floor. "Household office," he said. Imogen's solicitor objected to implication. The registrar overruled and continued. By 11, rulings were entered in a voice as dry as paper. Proxy language invalid absent personal execution. Any instrument purporting to transfer Elena Fletcher's signature authority suspended pending fraud inquiry. Immediate independent standing recognized for Elena in all matters tied to Kent workroom operations. Debt notes held through Wexford assignment acknowledged, and upon filing of voluntary reassignment tendered by Julian Hale, beneficial control of Fletcher workroom property transferred to Eleanor by valid deed, free of marital condition. The registrar pushed the deed toward her. "Miss Fletcher, accept?" She placed her palm flat on the page, feeling the raised impression of the seal under her skin. "I accept." Across the table, Imogen stood very still, as if stillness might substitute for leverage. For the first time since Eleanor was a child, her mother had no sentence that could narrow a corridor. "You are making an error," Imogen said at last. Eleanor met her gaze. Noted. 4 letters. Final. When they stepped out of Guildhall into clear noon light, the city looked unchanged and entirely different. Women passed with market baskets, carriages rattled, a boy chased a hoop along the curb. No trumpet announced vindication. Yet Arden handed her certified copies tied in red tape. Vale delivered bank acknowledgement of the countermand, and a messenger from the registry confirmed notices served to Bruton Street and Everley House before luncheon. External papers answered. Every call returned. Elena turned to Mr. Keats, who stood uncertainly near the steps with his hat brim in his hands. "Come to Kent," she said. "As steward, if you will have it." His eyes brightened once, then steadied. "I will have it, miss." "Then begin by sending for Mrs. Dallow, consulting hours only, at rates she sets." "That can be done." By late afternoon, she crossed the threshold of the Kent workroom with deed copies in her satchel and the old ledger under her arm. The room smelled of steam, chalk and lanolin, familiar as breath. Needles slowed, then stopped. 12 women looked up. Mrs. Dallow stood by the window table with a shawl over her shoulders and colour returning to her cheeks, her medicine bottle visible beside the pincushion. Elena set the deed on the cutting table and untied the red tape. Wages continue Friday as scheduled. Arrears from disputed invoices are being recovered. No one is dismissed for age, illness, or honesty. For one suspended beat, nobody moved. Then Hester Pike began to cry openly and laugh at herself for doing so. Nia Bell crossed herself with rough fingers. Mrs. Dallow came forward, rested both hands on the table, and said in a voice still thin but steady, "Then let us finish the naval coats properly." Work resumed with that sentence. Cloth lifted, shears opened. The room reclaimed its own sound. At dusk, when the final pressing was done and lamps glowed gold against the windows, Julian arrived without entourage and set a parcel on the corner table. Inside lay dark formal wool, superfine and severe, with Brandt and Hale's maker card, pinned discreetly to the selvage. "I require a coat for the winter session," he said. "From this house." Eleanor gestured to the fitting stand. "Then stand straight, my lord." He removed his coat and took position while she circled him with chalk and measuring tape, calling numbers to Hester for notation. Shoulder point true. Sleeve pitch adjusted 1/4 for riding posture. She marked, stepped back, marked again. On the nearby table, folded with almost ceremonial care, lay the weathered green flannel he had worn through every test and morning delivery. Cuffs turned, hidden stitches still intact. No longer disguise. Evidence. "You kept it," she said. "It did its work." She pinned the basted front across his chest and smoothed the lapel with her palm. "And now?" "Now, I do not require concealment." Her hands paused at the collar seam. Around them the workroom quieted respectfully, women intent on their own tasks while hearing every word. "Elena," he said, dropping title for the first time without urgency. "I have authority enough in public life. I would not bring it into this room unless you ask for it. If I stand here, I stand by your terms." She looked up at him. His grey eyes were steady, unguarded in a way they had never been in Bruton Street corridors. "Then hear mine," she said. "No arrangements spoken over my shoulder, no signatures managed, no kindness used as debt." "Agreed." She set one final pin at the shoulder, exactly where the old flannel had always fit too well to be ordinary, and allowed herself a small, unhurried smile. "Good," she said. "You may come for second fitting on Thursday." He smiled then, and it transformed his face from disciplined reserve to open warmth. "I will be punctual." When he had gone, Elena remained at the cutting table with the deed under one hand, and the measuring tape looped around her wrist, the old flannel folded beside new wool. both truths visible at once. Through the open door came the evening sounds of Kent. Cartwheels, distant bells, women laughing on their way home with wages secure in their pockets. In the room where she had once feared every ledger line, she stood exactly where she belonged, and no one there mistook her worth again.